Welcome back to the basement. I'm Steve Lewis. Today's episode is going to harken back and continue on from a couple earlier episodes. Episodes 4 and 5, The Beach Boys 1979 Parts 1 and 2. It's also going to touch back on a couple of more recent episodes. Episode 25, The Beach Boys Vault Cracks Open, and episode 26, Randy Bachman Meets the Beach Boys. You don't have to have seen those to enjoy this, I hope, but this is kind of a continuation, certainly, of episodes 4 and 5, and we'll reference those other episodes. In early 1980, I had picked up Byron Priest's authorized biography of the Beach Boys, which had come out in 1978. Picked it up in a bargain bin in Phoenix, Arizona, and I was rapidly devouring this book and had decided to become a Beach Boy completist. The first album to be released after that fateful decision of mine came out in March of 1980. Walked into a record store at the Christown Mall in Phoenix, Arizona, and there was the Beach Boys' new release. Of course, I'm talking about Keepin' the Summer Alive. The Beach Boys' big album release for 1980 came almost exactly a year, maybe a year and a week, after the release of the Light album in 1979. And I'll tell you, my first reaction upon seeing this album cover was, oh boy, well, maybe they'll make a decent album next time. This album cover and the title did not bode well for what I was hoping from the Beach Boys in 1980. But before we start talking about the album in depth, let's put it in context. What else was going on in music in early 1980? Of course, a lot of the big albums from 1979 were still high in the charts, still having hits. Some of those albums harken back to releases that had come in 1977. For example, the Eagles were following up their massive 1977 album Hotel California with the release of The Long Run late in 1979 with hits like I Can't Tell You Why, Heartache Tonight. Likewise, Fleetwood Mac had the big album of 1977, Rumors, and we're following that up with the long-awaited release of the album Tusk, which at the time was considered kind of overblown and kind of a disappointment, although I think it was maybe judged a little too harshly. Time has been a little kinder to this album than it has to some others. I particularly have grown to like that album a lot. Also following up a 1977 release, though this particular 1977 release was not that successful. The next release in the late 79, far, far more successful for them, was Pink Floyd with The Wall. This came out just prior to Christmas, and of course had hits well into 1980. I picked it up at the time, listened to it, I enjoyed some of the songs. I was a little too old for this at the time. I was 19, and I saw it as kind of a kid's album in a way, in the sense that things like Another Brick in the Wall Part 2 seemed to me to be pandering to high school kids. We don't need no education. I considered the themes and the lyrics on this to be a little bit simplistic and kind of pandering, not really up to the standards of things like Dark Side of the Moon or Wish You Were Here. But of course it was a massive, massive hit. People a little bit younger than me loved that album. Again, to me it was kind of like, well, this is an album for slightly younger people, and it's kind of a deliberate attempt to make them happy. Also, another trend going on, disco was rapidly fading, and the backlash was in the early stages. It was going to be a backlash like no other. And maybe the record companies were seeing some of that as they were putting out greatest hits albums of some of their big artists, trying to get a few more sales in before that bus really left the station. Case in point is Donna Summer's Greatest Hits on the Radio was released. It was a big hit still on the charts, but you could kind of see, and maybe the record companies kind of thought, we better get these greatest hits albums out quickly before the backlash really kicks in, and it was a good idea. Another example was Bee Gees' Greatest Hits. Now, great records, but at the time, the backlash was coming on fast. Of course, few people didn't get the message and didn't get out of the way in time, particularly Alan Carr and Nancy Walker with Can't Stop the Music, a film starring the Village People and Valerie Perrine. It was going to be the big disco film of the summer. Unfortunately, it wasn't the summer of 1978 or 1979. This came out in the summer of 1980. Right during the height of the disco backlash. You could see for months that this thing was going to be a huge, huge bomb, and apparently it recouped about 10% of the $20 million that it cost to produce. The disco backlash was on. Of course, Christmas time is also a good time for all sorts of greatest hits albums. Electric Light Orchestra also got their greatest hits released. Stevie Wonder's Secret Life of Plants, which had been considered something of a come down after his big album, Songs in the Key of Life, but still a pretty good album. Still had some chart action going on that, early 1980. Led Zeppelin's In Through the Outdoor, also still pretty high in the charts, though it had been released in the fall of '79. Michael Jackson's album, Off the Wall, had been released in '79, but it just continued to grow in popularity well into 1980. I really didn't become aware of it until early 1980 because I'd always considered the Jacksons to be sort of bubblegum. I kind of heard the hits off the last couple Jacksons album and thought they were pretty good, but it wasn't until I got to hear some of this on the radio sort of repeatedly that I had to admit, this is a pretty damn good record. And I guess I wasn't alone as the popularity of it continued to grow well into 1980. Also, finally getting real chart attention for the first time was Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers with Damn the Torpedoes. Refugee was on the radio everywhere, and a lot of the songs here got a lot of radio play. Tom Petty was finally really starting to hit as 1980 kicked off. Also, we got Christopher Cross with Sailing and Ride Like the Wind. It's an album that maybe a little more Beach Boy-esque. This maybe is the album the Beach Boys should have done instead of Keeping the Summer Alive. Anyway. Our old friend Bob Seger was back. He was older now, but still running against the wind. Terrible album cover, but a great album inside. Queen, kind of surprisingly, managed to come back with a very new look with the album The Game and Crazy Little Thing Called Love. Kind of surprised that they were hanging in there. They looked like maybe they had gone over the hill, but they came on strong with The Game. Things that were more interesting to me, of course, I was beginning to get a little more interested in new wave stuff. From late 1979, there were things like The Police, Regatta de Blanc, which I bought on a double 10-inch for some reason, and Joe Jackson's I'm the Man, which I bought as a collection of 45s rather than as an album. As you can see, 79, 78, they'd been playing around with releasing things as picture discs. At this point, they were also fooling around with different formats, which I embraced just for something different. Also released around that time, December of 1979 in the UK, and just a short time later, right at the beginning of January 1980, The Clash's London Calling. Weirdly, at the end of the 80s, in 1989, Rolling Stone named this the best album of the 1980s. And Joe Strummer, when he was asked about it, very understandably said, I thought that came out in the 70s, because it really did. It just barely squeaked in because the US released it a little late. Always thought that was just kind of a weird thing that the best album of the 80s, according to Rolling Stone, Actually came out in the 70s. Great music. Train in Vain got some radio play. This was the first Clash album that I bought as soon as it came out. Kind of a sprawl, as Clash albums always were, and a great cover paying homage to, of course, Elvis Presley's first album, and the great photos of the bass smashing by Paul Simonon that took place in September 1979 at the Palladium in New York. Really, really iconic shot. They got the shot that will live in infamy, as they say. Also, probably for me, the big album of 1980, my personal favorite, though I no longer have it on vinyl, was Get Happy by Elvis Costello. This album, I thought every song on it was phenomenal. I sold off my vinyl when they released it on CD with bonus tracks in the late 90s, mid-late 90s. Another big album at the time for me was the Ramones' End of the Century. A lot of people have mixed feelings about this. Phil Spector produced it. It was an attempt to sort of evolve the Ramones in a way, and they resisted evolution quite rigorously. It's still a great album, still has some great songs on it. The production, I can see, it's not exactly appropriate for the Ramones, but still, very strong album. And then later on, in 1980, we began to get the Pretenders on the radio, this being the Pretenders' first album. That was the kind of thing that I was really excited about early in 1980. We had hit singles such as Call Me by Blondie, Too Hot by Kool and the Gang, Gotta Be a Special Lady by Ray Goodman and Brown, Do That To Me One More Time by Captain and Tennille. Linda Ronstadt had her Mad Love album out. Billy Joel put out Glass Houses, both of which to me seem to sort of be hedging their bets with this new wave thing. Linda Ronstadt covered some Elvis Costello tunes. Billy Joel kind of adopted a new wave, more rock and roll-y look. Both of those artists seemed like they were trying to figure out how they were going to cope with the onslaught of new wave. We had Lips Inc. doing Funky Town. Anne Murray did a cover of the Monkees' Daydream Believer. We had Billy Preston and Sarita doing Born Again. We had Rupert Holmes with his hit Escape, the Pina Colada song, and its almost equally unbearable follow-up, Hymn. So there were also plenty of reasons to want to throw your radio out the window early in 1980. Obviously, there were a lot of changes going on in music, a lot of competing musical trends early in 1980, and into this fray lumbered our old friends, the Beach Boys, with Keepin' the Summer Alive. Spent a lot of time on background. Your patience will be rewarded in the next episode. We'll discuss Keeping the Summer Alive in depth, track by track then. Hope you've enjoyed this. Please like and subscribe. We'll see you next time. Bye.